So we're still in chapter 5. We have some details to work out with the allowance method. And the first thing we're going to talk about is a write-off. The allowance method estimates the amount of bad debt expense. So because it's estimating, it means it's not waiting until the moment at which some particular individually identified customer is not going to pay. In the allowance method, the write-off is when we identify a specific customer. Now, a write-off, what it means, we're going to write something off of the accounts, and it reduces the accounts receivable and the allowance. So when the bad thing happens that we predicted was going to happen, we don't recognize the expense. The expense was recognized when we estimated it, and the allowance allows for the bad thing to happen. Okay, so why is the allowance there? The allowance is there so when a bad thing happens, we can take the bad event out of the allowance. Because the allowance is a credit balance that was reducing our total assets. So when we see the write-off, here's a write-off for Fignon Incorporated. They notified us that they're going bankrupt, and we assessed our situation of bankruptcy and determined we weren't going to get anything. Sometimes you do get the inventory back and stuff like that, so you can recover it. But in this case, we're not getting any of the money back. We're going to have to write off. So we write off the allowance for the $500 and this accounts receivable. And I'm specifically identifying Fignon just to make it a little more particular. If I just put accounts receivable, that would be fine for a financial accounting course. But just to emphasize that we have, for the write-off, we have identified a specific customer that's not going to pay us. Okay? But what's very important to notice here is that there is no expense. When the write-off occurs, there's no expense under the allowance method. One other piece of terminology you need to be familiar with is net receivable. So moving on from write-off. The accounts receivable is how much you're owed. The allowance for bad debt is how much you expect not to get paid. And the net receivable is how much you expect to collect. Okay? So the amount that will be displayed on the balance sheet is the net receivable. Finally, I'm just going to do a head fake to this, and we're not going to actually do this accounting, but you should know that what is called the direct write-off method is permitted but not preferred under GAAP for bad debts. Under this method, you wouldn't recognize bad debt expense until you were going to write it off. That's why it's called the direct write-off method. Okay, so just know it's out there. Know it's not based on an estimate. Know that you only recognize the expense when you write it off. So it would be directly to accounts receivable. It would be bad debt expense, account receivable. But we're not going to do the accounting for that. All right, and we're going to be moving on to the next objective, which is notes receivable on the next video.